Today we're talking about our history of peacemaking. Which, to be clear, is an ambitious goal in 15 minutes. Because we are quite the peacemaker church, and our history is long and proud. And now, coming to the 5th of this sermon series, I realize I have left far more on the cutting room floor than I've actually brought here to these sermons. So it is now my intention to one day, in my fantasy, take a sabbatical and write this book, because I think we need, this history is so good. It's so rich, and I'm about to not do it justice. I also challenged myself oddly to not have texts when I'm preaching these sermons. I don't know, I guess you get to a certain age and think you need to make your life more interesting. So here I am. The thing is, when I started to think about peacemaking, the question of war doesn't make sense to me outside of the question of justice. War really is violence in response to embedded injustice, entrenched injustice that cannot move, when people feel like there's nothing else to do and they turn to violence. So if we want to talk about war, we have to talk about injustice. We have to talk about economic injustice, racial injustice. We have to talk about civil liberties, what people have access to, what people are denied, because all of that is the precursor to the violence that becomes war. When this church started, I'm also going to just make a note that this is my 5th, so I've told a lot of stories. I'm not going to retell the stories. So it's going to, sometimes I'm jumping over stuff because I did that already. But I will note, I said it last time, that the church, our first church, burned down. It went on fire twice. And that was in response to its abolitionist stance. So right from the beginning, the church is built and the fire takes it down because of our stance, because we were on the edge of a conversation that needed to happen. But if we're honest, our early church, other than being sort of on the stance of abolition, we weren't particularly bold. The church as a whole was sort of mellow. It was liberal, so it's kind of stood on the left for what that meant at the time. But I find the ministers to be kind of soft. They didn't really admonish people. I mean, they talked about wealth disparity, but they didn't talk about economic injustice. They sort of said things like, hoarding isn't good, but didn't say, you with $1 billion, it's time to share. So they were soft early on. But then we move on. Now, let me just say this. The ministers were soft, but I think the congregation wasn't. I think the congregation might have been a step before the ministers, at least in the early days. There was something called I wrote it down because I'd never heard of it before, the New York Vigilance Committee. Has anyone heard of this? I had never heard of it. You have? Well, of course you have. It's like the woman who knows everything. I should just call her and be like, tell me what I should say in my sermon today. So this committee started out as part of the Underground Railroad. It was the organizational committee in the city that was trying to help people who had escaped their enslavement and to do what they could on the floor, on the ground here, around the Fugitive Slave Act, around helping people to get free. There is no sign at all that ministers of this church ever were part of that committee, but there is a lot of sign that congregants were, that people in the congregation were acting as individuals doing work of justice in the city. And I feel like this was one of those times when the people were leading and the leaders were following. The other thing that I have learned about the 19th century here at what used to be the Church of the Messiah is that the women were the ones at the front of every line. The women's auxiliary here moved things forward. In fact, in the 19th century, when this church, I told this story about this church almost going broke, what happened is that the women's auxiliary got together, they literally knocked on doors of this neighborhood with their hands out and said, the church is going to close, so we would like you to give us some money. And they raised almost all the money this church needed. The women of this church were very much the powerhouse. They were the activists. They were the ones who were moving things forward. They had no vote. In the public sphere, they had no say. They had no voice, but they had their bodies, and the women of this congregation used that to move us forward. We do see, starting in 1849, the church getting a little more bold. You know, I realized in doing this really interesting parallel between what's happening now and what happened starting in 1850. Do you know the Fugitive Slave Act? Most of you do, no, few. The general idea of the Fugitive Slave Act was that if you were an enslaved person, the theoretical idea was if you were an enslaved person and you were south of the Mason-Dixon line, but you somehow made it to the north of the Mason-Dixon line, you could now live free. The federal government decided that that is not okay, and that if you are spotted north of the Mason-Dixon line, anybody can capture you and bring you back. That's the idea. The reality is that then started bounty hunters all over the North. Now, how do you prove that you are not an escaped slave? There's almost no way to do that. So if you are black and you are north of the Mason-Dixon line, bounty hunters, white people, could kidnap you, capture you or your children, and bring you back across the border, even if you were born free. This morning I thought, oh my God, this is what's happening with ICE. This is what we're doing. We have these bounty hunters, fully masked, on our streets, somehow legally kidnapping people and making them prove that they should be free, which they can almost never do because they're not actually given a trial or a court or lawyers or anything. So unless they have their passport on them, so that was just note to self. Here we are again. Anyway, the Fugitive Slave Act kicked things into gear in this church. People here started to make bolder stands, stronger stands. I'm not going to get into this too much because I'm afraid of taking up too much time, but I will say that we did have one minister, Robert Collier, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He brought people into his home, kept them safe, moved them on from there. There were people here who were doing their best to stand on the lines of justice, not only around racial justice, but economic justice. This congregation got bolder and bolder in its stance around labor rights, around children's labor, around women's labor. In particular, this congregation, the members of this church, started taking some bold stands around public education, because they realized that if you could get a public education system up to the age of 12, that children, and made it compulsory and free, that children would have to go to school and wouldn't be sent to warehouses. So this congregation got active in building a public education system. Now I just want to note, because everything comes around, in the moment this seemed wildly impossible. How could you ever fund an education system for a city this big, this many people, and require every child to go? It seemed way out of the realm of what was possible from ages 5 to 12. And then they did it. So when we talk today about free childcare and feel like there's no way we could ever afford it, we have done this before. We've done it before, we've done it bigger and better. So let's not be so afraid of adding a little something to make people's lives better. This church has been actively working to make people's lives better. We also took some strong anti-war stands in that time. We have Collier saying, "War ends nothing but life." And then he said, "Let no man be silent while his country sins." And the other, "We have sought glory and found guilt." So when John Haynes Holmes showed up here, it wasn't out of nowhere. We talk a lot about this church sort of changing and all of a sudden being a different thing. It wasn't a different thing. He was more of the same. He was bigger and bolder and faster and stronger, but he was more of the same. Savage before him did powerful pro-union work, big economic justice work, had settlement houses, was doing everything he could, poured himself into justice making in this city. He wrote a poem. He wrote a lot of economic justice poetry. Here's one: "Work, work, work. My labor never flags. And what are its wages? A bed of straw, a crust of bread, and some rags." He fought for a 5-day work week. He fought for an 8-hour day. He fought for things that nobody thought would ever happen here. And they happened. The church was behind him. The ministers were trying their best to use their power to move things forward. And then came John Haynes Holmes. Again, not out of nowhere. Holmes showed up here a radical. This is a church that called a radical. They did it on purpose, and they got what they asked for. He was famously anti-war. He made community church a hub of social reform. He understood church as public institution, which I would have to agree with. Church as public institution, here to serve the whole city. He said, "The measure of a society is the fate of the poorest within it." And after Holmes was Don Harrington. Don Harrington is a fascinating figure. If you are a student of Unitarian Universalism, right, if you go to seminary like some of our people, you will think Don Harrington made a really huge mistake. You'll learn all about his mistake, and I'm not going to deny he made a really huge mistake. And his mistake was that in the moment, Black Unitarian Universalists sought to have a Black caucus that was well funded. I'm making a very complicated story short, but he opposed it. And he opposed it. When you learn about it, you think, who is this guy? Like, how does he have so much power? How is it possible that one white guy can stop a major, important move in this denomination? And why? Why would he? But the more I know about Don Harrington, the more I understand. Don Harrington was a minister in this church. This is a multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational church. His experience was that people can work together, they can get along. He was, long before anyone else, he was anti-apartheid. Long before anyone was talking about that, he was talking about things happening in Africa and saying we have to find ways to bring unity, to bring community, to be in covenant with each other. His whole thing was, look, it works. Look around. People can pray together. They can live together. They can work together. We don't need something separate. He fought with all he had to stop it. He was ridiculously wrong. He was dangerously wrong. Someone should have stopped him and all the people behind him, many of whom I'm sure belonged to this church. Because the Black Caucus would have been a really good thing. But I have to say, as one of his successors, I actually sort of understand at least the impulse to look for unity and ways for people to work together. That's a simplification of a complicated problem. But I don't want his legacy to just be his mistake. I will also say that he was very political. He founded the Liberal Party here in New York. He ran for lieutenant governor with FDR Jr., his son. He worked hard for economic justice. He worked hard for democratic justice. He was successful in 100 ways. And unfortunately, in the denomination, he will be remembered for the way in which he failed. And then Bruce Southworth showed up. And Bruce extended this conversation. So until this time, peacemaking in this church was about economic justice and racial justice and war. And Bruce added some really cool things. He showed up in 1982 when the AIDS crisis was reaching its peak. He added LGBTQ rights to our list of things we need to work on. He worked for justice for people across the board, so LGBTQ teenagers, LGBTQ people who did not have homes. He worked for rent control, for tenants' rights. He poured himself into housing issues. He was one of the election monitors for the first free election in South Africa. He was quieter about his justice work, but he was also a leader in it. He said, the moral test of a city is the dignity with which it treats its poorest members. He also, in talking about prisons, said a just society cannot imprison its way to peace or safety. So we have a legacy. We have a history. And I want to just close with this. The story isn't over, right? What's going to happen in 100 years? What are they going to say about us? Who are they going to say we were? Who are our people and what are they doing? Are they creating a network to stop ICE from kidnapping children? I'd like them to say yes. Yes, they did that. Were they on the front lines of racial justice work in the city? I'd like them to say yes, they were doing that. Were they fighting for economic justice? Were they fighting for the poor? Were they fighting food insecurity? Were they fighting for their dream of a multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational society living together in peace? I would like them to say yes, they did that. I think that the land is set out for us. We have behind us 200 years of people who have done for us what maybe we could never have done for ourselves, but they have set it up for us so that we can be our best. We can design the world we dream about as long as we know we have the wind at our back and each other at our side. Everything can be ours. This city can become the dream if only we put ourselves forward to make it happen.